4 days after I buried my husband, I was sitting in a lawyer's conference room while my son-in-law slid a thick folder across the table and asked me to sign away control of the company I had spent 26 years building. I remember the folder more clearly than I remember the flowers at Robert's funeral. Maybe that sounds cold. It isn't. The funeral had blurred into a long sequence of handshakes, casseroles, sympathy cards, phone calls, and people telling me to take care of myself. I had barely slept. I was still finding Robert's coffee mug beside the sink and reaching for my phone before remembering there would be no message from him. Then, Evan decided it was time to talk business. He sat across from me in a dark suit, calm and polished, with my daughter beside him. Julia Bennett, the attorney Robert and I had used for years, sat at the end of the table with her legal pad open. Evan explained that the company needed stability. 6 early learning centers, more than 100 employees, hundreds of families depending on us. None of it, he said, could afford uncertainty while I was grieving. His solution was simple. He wanted to become interim CEO. He wanted control over daily operations. He wanted the ownership structure reviewed and reorganized. And, according to the documents in front of me, I would keep only a minority interest in the company I had built from one struggling childcare center into a regional business. Then, he gave me the sentence he probably believed would make everything sound reasonable. "Mom, this isn't about taking anything from you." I looked down at the agreement. There was nothing complicated about what it did. It transferred authority away from me. What bothered me was not only the proposal, it was the date printed near the bottom of the first page. I read it twice. The agreement had been prepared 2 days before Robert died. 2 days. At that point, I had been sleeping in a chair beside my husband's hospice bed, listening to the oxygen machine beside him and trying to believe we still had more time. I had never asked Evan to prepare anything. I had never told him I planned to retire. I had never even discussed stepping away from the company, yet he had already prepared the paperwork. Finally, I looked up. Who told me I was retiring? Evan barely paused. No one had to. He said I had been through a lot. He said I needed rest. He said Claire's future had to be protected. I looked at my daughter. She kept her eyes on the table. For a moment, I thought she had chosen him over me. Then I noticed her right hand. Her fingers were trembling beneath the edge of the table. It was a small thing, almost invisible, but I had been Claire's mother for 35 years. I knew the difference between anger, fear, and uncertainty. She wasn't comfortable with what was happening. That mattered. Evan pushed a pen toward me. I didn't touch it. I told him I needed time. He smiled. It was the kind of smile people give when they believe they have already won and are simply waiting for you to catch up. I gathered my bag and left the room. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse him. I didn't tell him I had noticed the date. I wanted him to believe I was too exhausted to understand what was happening. But on the drive home, I kept thinking about Robert. 4 days earlier, he had been in hospice. His voice had been weak, and his hand had felt strangely light in mine. We had spent 31 years married, and by then I had learned to understand him through small things. The way he squeezed my fingers, the way he looked toward the window when he was worried, the way he stopped talking when there was something he didn't know how to say. That afternoon, he had held my hand and told me something I didn't understand at the time. If anything happens, don't let them rush you. That was all. He never told me who they were. I had assumed he meant the doctors, the lawyers, the people calling about arrangements. Now I wasn't so sure. When I got home, the house was exactly as I had left it. Robert's coat was still hanging by the back door. His shoes were beneath the bench. His office smelled faintly of coffee and the cedar oil he used on his desk. I stood there for a moment, then walked inside. I wasn't looking for evidence. At least, I didn't think I was. I was looking for something that would make sense. On the corner of Robert's desk was a plain white envelope. No stamp, no address, just my name written across the front in his handwriting. Helen. I picked it up. My hands were steady until I saw the words beneath my name. For Helen, if I don't get to explain. And for the first time since my husband died, I stopped thinking about the funeral. I started wondering what he knew before he left me.
The envelope stayed on Robert's desk for almost an hour before I opened it. I kept finding reasons not to. I told myself I was tired, that whatever Robert had written could wait, that 4 days after his funeral was too soon to turn his last days into an investigation. Eventually, I sat in his chair and opened it. There was no confession inside, no long letter explaining who had betrayed us. There were only 2 things: a printed financial statement from the company and a small yellow sticky note in Robert's handwriting. One line was written across it: "Ask why Oak Ridge paid twice." Oak Ridge was one of our early learning centers. At first, I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because after everything that had happened, I had expected something bigger. Instead, Robert had given me an accounting question. So I pulled up Oak Ridge's payment records. The first transaction was for $18,740 to one of our regular vendors. The invoice looked ordinary, the date made sense, the amount matched the work listed. Then I found the second payment. Same amount, same general time period, but it had gone through a different vendor. I checked the invoice number, the service description, and the approval record. It wasn't an identical copy, but it was close enough that I couldn't dismiss it. I didn't decide that someone had stolen money. I'd run a business for 26 years. I knew the difference between a strange number and proof of wrongdoing. People made mistakes. Bookkeepers entered things twice. Software duplicated payments. So I called Daniel Reeves, our CFO. Daniel had worked with me for 14 years. He knew our books better than almost anyone, and before Robert died, I would have trusted him without thinking twice. I told him what I had found. He said it was probably an accounting error. That was reasonable. What wasn't reasonable was what happened next. I asked why the second payment had been routed through a company registered 3 counties away. There was a pause, maybe 3 seconds, but I heard it. Then Daniel said he would have accounting clean it up. That sentence stayed with me. He hadn't asked me to send him the records. He hadn't asked which transaction I meant. He hadn't said he would investigate it. He had immediately decided that the problem was something to be cleaned up. I wrote down the transaction number. Then I started looking. Not everywhere, not obsessively, just at records I already had access to. I went back through several months of company payments. I sorted them by vendor and amount, looking for numbers large enough to matter but small enough to disappear inside ordinary expenses. Most were under $25,000. That's what made them easy to miss. There were consulting charges, administrative fees, equipment expenses, maintenance payments, and reimbursements spread across different months and locations. Individually, none looked impossible. Together, they came to roughly $310,000. I sat back from the computer. $310,000 was not an accounting error I was comfortable explaining away. Still, I didn't know who was responsible, and I wasn't going to accuse anyone based on a spreadsheet. That afternoon, Evan came to the house. He brought takeout, coffee, and another stack of paperwork. I remember thinking how carefully he had arranged everything. Food for a grieving widow, coffee because he knew I wasn't sleeping, documents because he wanted to appear useful. He reminded me that I shouldn't be dealing with numbers right now. I asked how much Robert had left him in charge of. He said nothing. I asked why he was already acting like he had been given authority. He smiled. He didn't answer. That was the first moment I understood that Evan wasn't simply trying to help me through grief. He believed something had already changed. After he left, I went back into Robert's office. I opened his laptop. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. I only knew his warning had come from somewhere. The browser history showed a financial spreadsheet I recognized immediately. It was one of our internal reports. The last time Robert had opened it was 36 hours before he died. I stared at the timestamp. 36 hours. Robert had been looking at our financials while he was still in hospice when I was sitting beside him thinking about everything except money. I had always believed I knew the company better than anyone. I knew our centers, our staff, the families who trusted us, and how the business operated. But sitting there, looking at that timestamp, I realized something uncomfortable. Robert may have seen something I hadn't. I closed the laptop and called Julia Bennett. I told her I had found something in the company records and didn't want to confront anyone yet. She asked whether I wanted an internal audit. I said no. I wanted someone outside Evan's circle, someone he didn't know, someone who could look at the numbers without knowing what I hoped they would say. For the first time since Robert died, I wasn't waiting for someone else to tell me what was happening. I was going to find out.
The next morning, I called the number Julia had given me. Tom Ferris suggested we meet somewhere ordinary. No office, no dramatic exchange in a parking garage. We met at a diner about 20 minutes from my house, the kind of place where nobody paid much attention to who was sitting in the next booth. Tom arrived with a plain notebook and a cup of coffee. He didn't look like the private investigators I had seen in movies. He looked like a retired accountant who had taken a wrong turn on his way to breakfast. I handed him the records I had collected, the Oak Ridge payment, the other vendor records, Robert's note, the list of vendors I wanted him to examine, and the proposal Evan had put in front of me 4 days after the funeral. I started explaining what I suspected. He stopped me before I could say too much. "Don't tell me what you think happened. Tell me what you can prove." That changed the way I approached everything. Until then, I had been looking for something that would confirm my fear. Tom was looking for something that could survive being questioned. Over the next several days, he worked through the records without telling me what he expected to find. Privately, I was learning how little I knew about the money moving through my own business. The first name Tom brought back was Bright Path Consulting, LLC. Bright Path had received several payments from the company over the previous 18 months. On paper, the charges were for educational consulting. The descriptions were vague enough to fit almost anything: curriculum support, operational guidance, program development. But when Tom tried to verify the company itself, almost nothing existed. There was no functioning website, there were no identifiable employees, there was no physical office that matched the business records. The registered agent was the part that caught my attention. Tom traced the connection to a company Evan had been involved with several years earlier. It did, however, give me a reason to stop assuming every strange number had an innocent explanation. Then Tom looked at Evan. What he found was harder for me to hear. Evan was carrying roughly $420,000 in debt. Part of it was tied to gambling-related losses. Another portion involved a business loan that had fallen behind on payments. I knew Evan had always liked expensive things. I knew he cared about appearances, but I had never imagined the numbers were that serious. Even then, I didn't know whether he had taken anything from my company. I wasn't going to turn suspicion into guilt simply because I was angry. Tom also confirmed something about Daniel. Daniel had approved several of the payments we were reviewing. That made him important to the investigation, but it didn't make him guilty. Then Tom found something I hadn't known. Evan had access to our accounting system, not the kind of access that allowed him to see a report from across the room. He had credentials that allowed him to view, enter, and approve certain financial activity. I went back to Daniel. I asked him one question. Did Robert know? Daniel looked down before answering. He suspected something. I asked how long Robert had known.
Daniel's answer was short, long enough to be worried. I left his office without saying anything else. Later that evening, Tom sent me a record that made the situation more personal. Robert had instructed Daniel to freeze payments to several vendors. The instruction had been entered into the system. 2 days later, the freeze had been canceled. The login attached to the change belonged to Evan Cole. I stared at that record for a long time. It wasn't a confession or proof that Evan had stolen money, but it was proof that Evan had intervened in financial matters Robert had specifically ordered Daniel to stop. That night, I went back into Robert's office. I didn't turn on the overhead light. I sat in his chair and looked around at the things he had left behind. Then I noticed a cardboard box on the bottom shelf. Robert had written one word on the side: family. I opened it. There were photographs of Claire when she was little. There were pictures of Noah at birthdays, school events, and one summer trip when he was still missing his front teeth. There were a few letters Claire had written to Robert over the years. Nothing about the company, nothing about money, just our family. I closed the box. Whatever Evan had done, whatever Daniel knew, whatever Robert had discovered, I wasn't going to let the investigation become another thing that damaged Noah. That was the part I could control. The rest would have to come from facts. My phone rang a few minutes later. It was Tom. He didn't explain. He only said, "Helen, I found something about your grandson." Then the line went quiet, and for the first time, I realized the financial records might not be the most dangerous thing Robert had been trying to warn me about.
The next afternoon, Noah came to my house for something that had nothing to do with money. He wanted one of Robert's old hoodies. It was the gray one with the small company logo on the chest. Robert used to wear it when he worked outside or took Noah fishing. Noah had grown up around that hoodie, so when he asked if he could have it, I said yes. I didn't ask him about Tom's phone call. I didn't ask what he had heard. I didn't even mention Evan. We stood in the hallway while Noah tried to remember which closet his grandfather kept it in. We talked about school, his classes, and a game he had coming up. It was ordinary conversation, and I was grateful for it. Then, while folding the hoodie over his arm, Noah stopped. He told me his dad had been acting strangely since Robert got sick. I asked what he meant. Noah explained that Evan had started taking phone calls on the balcony, even when it was cold. When he was inside, he often locked the door to his home office. Noah had heard him talking about the company more than once, especially in the last few weeks of Robert's illness. At first, none of that sounded like proof of anything. Adults took private calls, business owners locked office doors, people talked about work when they were stressed. But Noah remembered one sentence because it had sounded strange to him at the time. He had said that after Robert was gone, everything would be finally easier. Noah didn't know what that meant. Neither did I. Then he remembered something else. He had heard Evan say that the old structure was going to change. I asked what Noah thought he meant. He told me he assumed Evan was talking about the company. Then he paused. He said he no longer thought that was what Evan meant. I didn't push him. I asked only whether he was sure about what he had heard. He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't completely sure what any of it meant. That was important. Noah was my grandson, not my witness. I didn't want him carrying the weight of an adult investigation or feeling responsible for what happened next. He took the hoodie and left a few minutes later. I thought the conversation was over. It wasn't. Claire arrived before dinner. She knew Noah had been at the house, and she was angry that I had spoken to him privately. The argument wasn't really about the hoodie. It was about everything that had happened since Robert died. Claire believed I was pulling Noah into something he shouldn't have to understand. I believed I was trying to protect him from something that might already be affecting his family. Then she said something that stopped me. "You always do this." I asked what she meant. She told me I found a problem and turned it into a project. I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to list every decision I had made for our family, every difficult choice, every sacrifice, every time I had stepped in because I thought I knew what was best.
But none of that would have answered what she was really saying, so I didn't use it. I told her she was right. It was the hardest answer I could have given. Then I told her I should have noticed she needed me before she had to ask. Claire didn't suddenly forgive me. She didn't hug me. She didn't tell me everything was fine. She stood there quietly for a moment, then picked up her purse. But before she left, the anger in her face had changed. It wasn't gone. It was simply no longer the only thing between us. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table and thought about how easily a mother can confuse taking care of people with controlling the situation. I had spent years solving problems before anyone asked me to solve them. Now I was beginning to understand that sometimes people didn't need a solution. They needed someone to notice. My phone rang. It was Tom. He had followed the financial records further. He had found something connecting Evan and Daniel to the same person. That was serious. But it wasn't the part that made me sit up. The name was Marcus Hale. Tom told me Marcus had worked at a fertility clinic years earlier. I wrote the name down. Tom repeated it once so I wouldn't misunderstand. Then I looked at it again. I had never heard it before. At least, I didn't think I had. And suddenly, the conversation with Noah felt different. The company was one problem, the strange payments were another, Evan's behavior was another, and Claire's anger was something I needed to face myself. But Marcus Hale belonged to a part of our family's history I had never expected to see connected to any of them.
The name Marcus Hale stayed with me after Tom's call. I barely slept that night, not because I understood what Marcus had to do with Noah, but because I didn't. After everything we'd already uncovered, I had learned to be careful with assumptions. The next morning, Tom explained how he had found the connection. He had not broken into medical records. He had not accessed a sealed fertility file. He had followed a legal trail that began with a public genealogy database. Years earlier, someone related to Marcus had uploaded a genetic profile to a public genealogy service. The profile itself did not identify Noah. It simply created a family connection that Tom could investigate. There was another piece. When Noah was younger, Claire had agreed to let him take a consumer DNA test. It had been a harmless family history project at the time. Noah was curious about where different branches of our family came from, and nobody had expected the results to matter beyond that. Now those old results showed a close genetic match connected to Marcus's family. That still wasn't enough. Tom made that very clear. A genealogy match could point toward a relationship, but it wasn't the same as legally establishing one. So Julia arranged a proper test with the appropriate consent and chain of custody. I waited for the results without telling Noah anything. When Julia finally confirmed it, she did not dramatize it. Marcus Hale was biologically related to Noah. He was his biological father. I sat at my kitchen table with the result in front of me and realized that one fact changed the meaning of years of family history. But I also understood immediately that Noah was 16. He was not a piece of evidence. He was not a secret that needed to be exposed because the truth was dramatic. Julia warned me that we had to handle the information carefully. She told me that we didn't tell a 16-year-old something like this simply because it was shocking. We told him when we were certain, when his mother was ready, and when there was a plan to protect him. That made sense to me. For once, I didn't want to rush toward an answer. I wanted to protect the person who had the least control over what the adults had done. But there was another question I couldn't ignore. How did Evan know? Tom went back through the records. What he found was an old email. It was between Evan and Marcus. The date was 11 years earlier. I read that date several times. 11 years. Noah had been 5. This wasn't something Evan had discovered after Robert died. It wasn't something that had surfaced during the recent financial problems. Evan had known about Marcus for years. I went to Claire. She looked stunned when I showed her the name. She had never heard the story I was piecing together.
When I asked whether Evan had ever mentioned Marcus, she remembered only one thing. He had once described Marcus as an old family friend. That was all. Claire had believed him. I could see the confusion on her face, but I didn't have an answer that would make it easier. Tom eventually found more. Marcus had known for years that Noah was his biological son. He had not accidentally discovered it recently. He had known, and he had stayed away. The reason was worse than I expected. Evan had confronted Marcus years earlier and warned him what would happen if he came forward. Claire's marriage could collapse. Noah could be pulled into a public family scandal. Marcus could lose whatever limited access he had to the boy. According to the records Tom found, Marcus agreed to remain silent. But silence had not been free. Evan had helped Marcus conceal several financial transactions, the same kind of transactions that had now appeared inside our company records. That's when the story stopped looking simple. I wanted there to be one villain. It would have been easier. Instead, there were people making selfish choices for reasons they believed justified them. Marcus had stayed away from Noah, perhaps believing that loving him from a distance was better than destroying his life. Evan had protected his marriage and his own position by controlling a truth that was never his to control. Claire had lived inside a marriage without knowing the information that could have changed her choices. And Noah was the only person who never got to decide whether he wanted the truth. That was the part I couldn't accept. Not the money, not even the betrayal. It was the fact that an entire adult circle had made decisions about Noah's identity while Noah himself had no voice in any of them. I called Tom that evening. I asked him how much money Marcus had taken. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he told me that wasn't the question anymore. I asked him what the question was. His answer changed the direction of the entire investigation. He said, "Who helped him hide it?" And suddenly, I understood why Robert had written only 6 words on a yellow sticky note. Ask why Oak Ridge paid twice. He hadn't been asking me to find a missing payment. He was asking me to follow the connection. The question Tom had left me with was no longer how much Marcus had taken. It was who had helped him hide it. Over the next few days, the answer became harder to ignore. Tom and the forensic accountant he brought in rebuilt the company's payment history one transaction at a time. They did not rely on one suspicious invoice or one login record. They followed the money across vendors, accounts, dates, and approvals. The total was about $1.8 million, nearly 5 years of payments. The money had not gone directly from our company to Marcus. That would have been too easy to see. It moved through Bright Path Consulting, then through another vendor that existed mostly on paper, then through 2 intermediary accounts before portions of it were used to cover debts and other obligations. That distinction mattered. Marcus had not simply been taking money whenever he needed it. Someone had helped create a system that made the withdrawals look like ordinary business expenses. And that brought us back to Evan. Evan had not received the entire $1.8 million. His benefit was more scattered. There were consulting fees that had no clear business purpose. There were payments that helped cover debts. There were transfers connected to accounts he could access. But the most valuable thing Evan had received wasn't money. It was silence. Marcus had every reason to stay quiet about Noah, and Evan had spent years making sure that silence remained useful. Once I understood that, the proposal Evan had placed in front of me 4 days after Robert's funeral looked completely different. It wasn't a rushed attempt to help a grieving family. It was part of a plan. If I signed, Evan would gain operational control over all 6 centers. He would have greater access to the company's finances. He could remove me from daily operations, reorganize ownership, and create distance between me and the records he had been involved in managing. Most importantly, he would have more time to hide what was missing. The proposal had been prepared before Robert died, because Evan had already been planning for the possibility that Robert would no longer be there to interfere. That was the part that hurt most, not because I suddenly saw Evan as a monster, because I remembered him as a young man at our dinner table, as Claire's husband, as Noah's father, as someone Robert had once trusted enough to bring into the business. Then Tom found something else. Robert had suspected Evan. Not everything, not the full structure. Robert had not known about every account or every connection, but he had noticed enough irregularities to become concerned. He had started asking Daniel questions. He had reviewed vendor payments. He had ordered certain payments frozen. And at some point, he had decided he needed to talk to me. He never got the chance. That's when I finally understood the purpose of the envelope on his desk. Robert hadn't left me a complete answer. He'd left me a direction, a way to start asking the questions he had been unable to finish. Julia told me we could confront Evan, but she strongly advised against it. If Evan knew we had uncovered the structure, he could destroy records, move money, change passwords, or shift the blame toward Daniel. So I agreed to wait. I let him believe the proposal had worked. I asked questions about timing. I let him see a tired widow who seemed overwhelmed by paperwork and willing to let someone else take over. Inside, nothing had changed. Tom was completing the timeline, the forensic accountant was verifying the transactions, Julia was preparing the legal documents, and the appropriate authorities had been notified. I didn't tell Evan any of that. I also told Claire what I knew. I didn't ask her to defend me or choose sides. I told her I needed her to watch what was happening in her own household. I told her I didn't need her to believe me. I don't need you to believe me. I need you to watch. Claire started checking the family finances herself. Within days, she found something I had not known about. Evan had hidden a debt from her. It wasn't the entire financial picture, but it was enough to confirm that the man she lived with had been keeping major financial information from her. She didn't confront him, neither did I. We were both beginning to understand that the truth was safer when it was documented than when it was shouted. Then Julia called. She told me we had enough evidence to stop Evan, enough to move forward, enough to make sure he could no longer quietly control the company. I told her no. She asked what I was waiting for. I had spent days watching Evan believe he was about to inherit a company he had already begun treating as his. Now I wanted to see how far he would go while he still believed he had won. I answered her with the only thing I was certain of. Not yet. Because if Evan thought he had already won, I wanted him to show us exactly what he believed he owned.
The meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning. Evan arrived 12 minutes early. I knew because Tom had told me he was already in the parking lot before I even sat down. Evan was wearing a new navy suit. He carried a leather folder under one arm, and the attorney draft I had seen earlier was tucked neatly inside it. He looked prepared, confident, certain. That was exactly what I wanted him to feel. Claire sat beside me. I had asked her to come, but I had not told her everything I had learned. She knew enough to understand that Evan had lied about money and that there were serious questions about the company. She did not yet know what Julia was bringing into the room. I looked tired. I made sure of it. I kept my movements slow. I let my hands rest on the table. I didn't correct anyone when they assumed grief had finally worn me down. Evan began with concern. He talked about how much I had been through. He said I needed time to recover. He said Claire needed protection from the pressure of running the business. He described his proposal as a temporary solution that would keep all 6 centers stable. The words sounded responsible. That was what made them dangerous. He presented himself as the son stepping forward when his mother needed help. But underneath the language was the same plan I had seen 4 days after Robert's funeral. Evan would take control of daily operations.
He would gain broader access to the company's finances. I would become a minority owner with less involvement. He spoke as though the decision had already been made, and the only thing left was my signature. I let him finish. Then I asked one question. When did you decide I wasn't capable of running my own company? Evan immediately tried to soften it. He said that wasn't what the agreement was about. I reached for the copy of his proposal. I turned it toward him and pointed to the date. Then why was this agreement dated 2 days before Robert died? He stopped. For several seconds, nobody moved. That was the first moment I saw the confidence leave his face. Julia opened the folder in front of her. There wasn't one envelope, there were 3 folders. The first contained the financial audit. The number at the top was $1.8 million. Nearly 5 years of payments. Bright Path Consulting, the second vendor, the intermediary accounts, the approvals, the records connecting the transactions. Evan looked at the pages but didn't touch them. Julia opened the second folder. It contained communication records showing Evan's contact with Marcus Hale, old emails, dates, messages, enough to establish that Evan had known about Marcus for years and had communicated with him long before Robert died. Then Julia opened the third folder. This one contained the DNA confirmation. The result established Marcus's biological relationship to Noah. Evan's reaction changed 3 times in less than a minute. First, he denied everything. Then he became angry. Then he tried to shift the responsibility onto Marcus. He said Marcus had manipulated him. He said he had only been trying to protect Claire and Noah. Finally, he looked directly at Claire. He said he did all of this to protect you. Claire didn't raise her voice. She didn't move to him. She only asked, "Protect me from what?" Evan had no answer. Then Julia explained something else. Marcus was not in the room. He didn't need to be. He was already cooperating with investigators. That was when Evan understood that the person he had depended on for silence was no longer protecting him. There was nowhere left for him to push the blame. Claire looked at him. She asked how long he had known. Evan stayed silent. She asked again about Noah. He still didn't answer. That silence told her what words couldn't. I watched my daughter sit across from the man who had spent years deciding which truths she was allowed to know. For a moment, I thought about everything I wanted to say. I could have reminded Evan that I had warned him. I could have told him that Robert had suspected him. I could have listed every lie. I said none of it. Instead, I looked at him and told him the only thing that mattered. You came here thinking you were taking my company. You were never taking anything. You were asking me to hand you the keys to a house you had already been setting on fire. Then I stopped. There was no satisfaction in saying it, no victory, just exhaustion. The company would need lawyers, accountants, investigators, and probably years of work to repair what had been damaged. The money would not magically come back because we had found the people responsible. Robert would not come back because I had finally understood his warning. And Noah would still have to live with the truth that the adults around him had hidden for years. So I turned toward Claire. I didn't tell her what to do. I didn't tell her whether to stay, leave, forgive, or never forgive. I simply told her that she didn't have to decide anything that night. For once, I wasn't trying to solve her life for her. I was giving it back to her.
The investigation did not end with the meeting. That was something I had to learn quickly. Marcus was investigated for embezzlement and fraud. Evan faced investigation for conspiracy, fraudulent transactions, and misuse of company funds. The lawyers handled the rest. I didn't decide their punishment, and I didn't need to. For years, I had believed justice meant making the people who hurt us understand exactly what they had done. I was wrong. The consequences came through the law, through records, through people doing their jobs properly. That was enough. Claire filed for divorce. She wasn't suddenly fearless after that. Some mornings she questioned every decision she had made during her marriage. She wondered how she could have missed so much. There were days when she felt embarrassed that she had trusted Evan. I never told her that I had seen the warning signs first. I never said, "I told you." I just stayed. Sometimes that meant sitting with her over coffee without trying to fix anything. Sometimes it meant answering the phone when she called late at night because she couldn't quiet her thoughts. Eventually, we had a conversation I had avoided for most of my life. Claire asked why I had always chosen work. I could have explained everything I had done for our family. Instead, I gave her the truth. I thought building something for you was the same as being there for you. She looked at me and said it wasn't. I told her I knew. There was no argument after that, just an uncomfortable silence, and then something I had wanted for years but never known how to ask for: honesty between us. The conversation about Noah came later. Claire and I told him together. We explained that Marcus was his biological father. We explained that Evan was still the man who had raised him. We didn't tell Noah what he was supposed to feel. He could be angry. He could be curious. He could want nothing to do with Marcus. Or he could decide years from then that he wanted to know more. The choice belonged to him. Noah asked whether the truth changed who Robert had been to him. Claire answered no. I told him that family wasn't a blood test. But I also made sure we didn't use that sentence to erase the truth. Blood didn't define the whole family, but biology was still part of Noah's story, and he had a right to know it. I also made a decision about the company. I did not hand it to Claire. Being my daughter did not automatically make her ready to run 6 centers. She agreed, so she started with one. For 9 months, Claire learned the parts of the business most people never saw: payroll, licensing, staff management, parent complaints, budgets, compliance. She wasn't given a title that made her sound important. She was given work that made her capable. I watched her handle a frustrated parent without becoming defensive. I watched her respond to an employee's mistake without immediately reaching for punishment. When one expense went over budget, she sat down and traced every line instead of pretending the number wasn't there. Slowly, I understood the difference between Claire and Evan. Claire didn't want to own the company, she wanted to understand it. After 9 months, I gave her responsibility for 1 center. It was enough. Robert's name also became part of something new. I established the Robert Mercer Family Learning Fund. It wasn't designed for wealthy families or people who already had every advantage. It supported single mothers, childcare workers, parents returning to school, and families struggling with childcare costs. Robert had spent his life building a business around families. I wanted his legacy to help families outside our own. Inside the company, I changed the system too. The Mercer Family Trust created independent oversight, annual external audits, dual authorization for major financial decisions, clear ownership documents, and a formal succession plan. No single person would ever again have the kind of unchecked control Evan had gained. That wasn't revenge. That was repair. One Sunday morning, I stood inside our first center before the children arrived. Noah stopped by. Claire was in the office helping a new employee learn the scheduling system. A child ran down the hallway laughing while sunlight came through the front windows. Robert's photograph hung near the entrance. Noah looked at it, then asked whether I thought his grandfather would be proud. I looked toward Claire, then I looked back at Noah. I think he'd be relieved. Noah asked why. Because we're finally taking care of each other. For a long time, I thought my legacy was the 6 centers, the money, the property, and the ownership shares. I don't think that anymore. I spent 30 years building something people could inherit.
It took losing almost everything to understand what I actually wanted to leave behind. Claire could finally tell me the truth. Noah didn't have to grow up inside a house full of secrets, and Robert was still present in the things he believed were worth protecting. A legacy isn't what your children receive when you're gone, it's what they learn from you while you're still here.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.